So my name is Philip Dawson, and I'm a policy officer in the ICAO Secretariat. And I will be filling in periodically over the course of the week as your Master of Ceremonies. Before we continue with our program in our first session of RPAS 3, it's time to go over some important housekeeping information which will be helpful to you this week. I promise I'll keep it quick, but it may not be painless. So again, we would be grateful if you would kindly turn off or place on silent mode your telephones and any other electronic equipment that might distract from the proceedings. Speakers, if you have not already given us your presentations, please do so as soon as possible. You may bring them to me at the next break. We would encourage you to download the Symposium app, which you can find on the App Store by searching for Events at ICAO. For those of you who have trouble downloading the app, you may also access it via the web, and I noticed that there are some handouts being passed around the room with the URL address. It is also up here on the screen. The app should be a great way to connect with other attendees throughout the week, submit questions to our moderators, and also keep track of our agenda. Some of you asked me during the coffee break in the outside corridors where lunch would be held. So, lunch will be held in the restaurants in the courtyard of the Global Center just beyond the hotel lobby, by the Phoenix Pavilion and the Paradise Island Cafe by the pool. Alternatively, there are food halls in the basement of the Global Center shopping mall to the rear of the building. Finally, please take note of the 5 emergency exits on the right-hand side of the venue. In the event of an emergency, we ask that you please be orderly, and if ever you feel uncomfortable or unwell during the symposium, please let the staff know, and they will assist you in locating the clinic inside the hotel. All right. It's time to get started with our first session, which relates to the important topic of categorization, responding to the rapid expansion and growth of the unmanned industry. Our speakers will discuss the challenges to the existing operational environment and the need for a new paradigm for regulating RPAS that considers the aircraft and operation jointly. To help us navigate this complex topic, I would like to introduce the moderator for this session, Mr. Nico Voorbach. Nico is the Director of ICAO and Industry Affairs for CANSO, the Civil Air Navigation Services Organization. He is a professional commercial pilot with 15 years of experience in international and government affairs, including as a former president of the European Cockpit Association. Nico, it's a pleasure to have you here, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction and the introduction of the session, which will start the week officially with experts speaking about the issue and how the way forward. I also want to thank ICAO and the organizers of the event for having us here, and I'm glad to see all of you here to listen to this exciting topic. We're living in a different time. Everything is going very fast, and we really have to look into this as good as it can. As we heard already this morning, the whole UAS RPAS is growing very fast. Innovations are following each other very fast, and we really have to get ahead of this to see it happening. So how do we do this with this very growing industry? It's growing in diversity, in types, in operations, and in sizes. Nothing seems the same. Everything seems different. So how do we do that? How do we deal with this? How do we deal with integration? How do we deal with separation or interaction between the UAS, RPAS, and the civil aviation? We always have to take into account safety. Safety is the most important in civil aviation, but it will also be mostly important in the RPAS operations. So we have to look how we make regulations, how we make guidance, to see how they can be safely integrated into our system or be separated from our system, so that we do not deteriorate the safety that we have in civil aviation. Because you all know that last year was the safest year in civil aviation that we had since the more than 100 years of civil aviation. So how do we regulate? This session will talk a bit about how do we regulate and how do we enhance the regulations on this issue. So how do we categorize all those operations? Do we do it by size? Do we do it by weight? Or do we do it by operations that they provide or in the areas that they work? For this, we have 4 excellent experts here today who can bring you the insight of how regulations are looked at in Europe, in the JARUS and in other issues, but also give you an insight on how the airline industry from IATA look at it. So today we have Mike Lissone, who is the Secretary General of JARUS, who will be presenting first, followed by Mr. Yang Honghai, who is the Regional Director North Asia Safety and Flight Operations of IATA, Mr. Scott Duffy, who is the Manager of Remotely Piloted Aircraft Operation of CASA in Australia, and Mr. Mark Wuennenberg, who is the Technical Officer of Remotely Piloted Aircraft in ICAO. Please listen carefully. If you have any questions, as said before, please send them via the app or via the link on the website towards us, and we will make sure that we have some time after this session for your questions to be answered by those experts. Well, that's enough of me. I'm not the expert really on this issue. That's why we have those 4 people here. And I would like to ask Mike to start his presentation. Thank you.
Good morning and welcome to RPAS 3. I'll try to give you an overview what we from JARUS are actually about. There's a lot of things said about JARUS, and also an example on how we've developed a categorization that is now going to be implemented in Europe through EASA. So what is JARUS? First we were confronted with one of our members. He came to the office on Monday morning and there was a white piece of paper, completely blank on his desk, with a very small note to it, please develop your own rules. And of course this was quite a challenge, and there's a challenge for all the states at the moment. And instead of working in total isolation, he decided to call colleagues from other states with the big question, how are you doing it? And what are your lessons learned? And these were the first steps in developing JARUS. So now we got more than 55 countries, including EASA and Eurocontrol, and what we develop is proposals, nothing more than proposals for regulation for states. And it's up to them to see how they want to implement these and how to use these as BART. What we also have, and that's the start in the beginning where we didn't have a very good connection to the industry, is that we have the stakeholder consultation body. And we have the chairman here, Frederick Nordstrom, just been elected, and we're working very closely with them. But it's a wide variety of stakeholders, so also there it's going to be quite difficult to have one voice, because one voice is going to be very conservative, affecting pilots and general aviation, and the other ones are going to be very innovative, being the drone manufacturers and the operators who want to do more. I won't go through all these members and all these lists because I can't even read it from here. But you can see we're growing, and it's not because that all the member states are actively contributing from the beginning, but it's also a perfect environment to share best practices and lessons learned, comparing bruises and scars, and to listen and to learn from other states that are much more advanced on that side. So the stakeholder consultation body was established in 2015, and like I mentioned, it is a very wide UES community, from the manufacturers, also from ANSPs, and U-Space or UTM providers, manufacturers of large and smaller, and also from manned parts. It's a wide organization with a lot of impact and a lot of input to what we are developing, which makes the documents that we are delivering, the products, much more stronger. The working groups, I'll go into slight more detail about that. We have 7 working groups on flight crew licensing, on operations, airworthiness, detect and avoid, The data link part on command and control, safety and risk management, and concept of operations. Now, I will not read them all to you because I'm the first presenter and I don't want to let you fall asleep already in the morning. But this is a list of all our deliverables. We are quite active and we deliver quite a lot. And it basically already started in 2013. And last, in the latter part, in this year, we have SORA, our specific operational risk assessment, and also the operations in that part. The slides are available to you. Have a read through them, and you can see that at that moment, these things are there. If you want to have some more information, just go to our website and go get in contact with me. The working groups, we have the flight crew licensing part, so the requirements for licensing and competencies, and also the pilot licensings and training on that part. The operations part is the requirements for access to airspace and the operational requirements. The airworthiness part, all the way from CS LURS and LUAS, the very light ones, and also the airships and the tethered balloons. The detect and avoid, just in ICAO, also the ones struggling the most because there is no legacy material to develop this part. Looking at the definement of the performance provisions and also on the safety objections. Command and control communications, safety and risk management, and the safety and risk part is mostly now focusing on the further development of the SORA and also on the standard scenarios, and also working group 7 looking at concept of operations in classification scheme, and a little bit more on the classification scheme later on in the slides I've got from my colleagues from IATA. So the activities we have are quite a lot. We have 2 plenary meetings a year. So you can see this year we had one in Cologne in Germany, and we'll be going to San Diego in October. We have improved the functioning of JARUS. You can imagine with 55 member states all around the world having just one chairman coming either from the US or from Europe, that the representation is not there. So now we have included 2 additional ones. So we have 1 chair from China, Dr. Liu Hao. We have 1 from Europe, Mr. Yves Morier from IASA, and 1 from the FAA, Chris Swider. That makes it a bit more easier to do, and also we have fixed the meeting location, so more in advance you'll know where you're going to. But you can see from the places where we're going quite worldwide. So we had some internal consultations in regard to the SORA standard scenarios and annexes. That's already been closed. The ops categorization, section 5 in the high risk part, the AMC 1309, and that's the issue 3 already, and Cat B operations. So for the external consultations, also there, it's the categorization part, Ops Cat A, the SORA package that has just been closed for external consultation that also consisted a standard scenario, and the cooperation with ICAO. Actually, it doesn't have to mention this on the slide because 90 to 95% of the people inside JARUS also are in the panel or in the advisory group. Upcoming activities is that we're working on the flight crew licensing part on competencies, the rules for operations in Cat A and B, the CSUS in looking at type certification with operational limitations. We're providing something on design objectives for detect and avoid and the requirements for surveillance, and of course the remain well clear and the collision avoidance part. The framework for defining the C2 link specifications, well, like I mentioned, also the SORA annexes and standards, and the RPAS operational categorization. What we're also doing is a bit of brainstorming on JARUS. At the moment, the package of what we're doing is clearly defined, but also the limitation in time is also there. What we are really focusing on now is UTM, and also defining a kind of regulatory framework for regulators to have a look in how this UTM would fit from that perspective. What are the do's and don'ts? On the categorization. So it's been developed by JARUS, initially by the FAA, by Stephen George. He started with this, and that is the part where you already heard a lot of people saying, categorization, how do we do it? Is it the things that we've done in the past, very conventionally, looking at weight? And every time we started on this part, we got stuck, because then there was an IFR one weighing only 57 kilos. It was very difficult to do. So we concentrated on the operational perspective. And this is how IATA will implement this later this year on that part. So we have the open category, we have the specific category, and we have the certified. Now, IFR will mean certified. But certified will not always mean IFR. There can also be a smaller one where the risk of the operation is simply too high by copying it on that part. So the open part is the low risk, it's the buy and fly perspective. We go all the way up to 25 kilos, but there is also 3 subcategorizations in there, clear of people, close to people, and flying over people. It's there to give the states quite a bit more flexibility in using the open part without a lot of, let's say, burden on the CAA providing the operations. The specific ones, that is the category that we envisage to have the largest potential. You've seen the UPS videos. That is the part where we have authorizations from the NAA and where the operator should perform the specific operational risk assessment. And then hopefully also that we have standard scenarios that can be applied with an approach like a tick in the box where the operator knows exactly what he needs to be doing on that part. That is the part where we have just closed on the external consultation. We have received quite some comments. So it will take some time to come back on that part, but that is where we're moving forward. The certified part is just the same approach that we have classically in manned aviation on that side, and this is how these parts are moving forward. Also, the work now moving forward. Now, these are typical slides of IATA with a huge amount of bullet points. Also, time-wise, Nico made clear I had around about 10 minutes, so I will not go through all these parts, but this purely shows that this is an operational centric performance and risk-based approach that is now been implemented in the EU member states by 2018. It allows a lot of, let's say, type of operations in the open category on such, and gives a lot of flexibility to the member states. We have an implementing act. That is the part where the states will have to follow exactly what is there. And we have a delegated act where there's a lot of flexibility for the states to adapt these rules slightly according to what's happening in their states. So there's a little key role there also in the part for the security, privacy, and environmental parts, because these are also things that are popping up much stronger in the development of regulation, because they play a much larger role, especially at the lower airspace part. And we're working closely together with member states, manned and unmanned aircraft communities, Commission, also the area where I'm from Eurocontrol, but also ICAO, the FAA, and Transport Canada. So that cooperation shows very well that we're all sharing our burden on this part in moving forward. I won't go through all these because this basically shows the typical way that we are doing in Europe with working to the Commission with legislative proposals, but it shows you very closely that in the last bullet point that we say that all the delegate acts and all the parts should be in place by the end of this year, providing a harmonized approach for regulation in Europe, which shows that in the 28 member states there will be harmonization on that side. And so far, my story on JARUS and what we're doing in Europe.
Thank you very much, Mike, and very interesting to hear how all those states come together and try to make it work worldwide with the JARUS. I found it very interesting, the categorization, that is three categories and subcategories on how they operate. And I gather that there will be a lot of questions from the audience later on that, because it's really fascinating how that you within JARUS are dealing with this. Our next speaker from the airlines, IATA, Mr. Honghai. Thank you.
大家好，我是来自于中国国际航协的杨洪海。因为呢，无人机的这个航道呢发展的非常快，在它的术语中呢，在中文和英文之间有很多的这种差异，还有很多不一致的地方。所以说我这次演讲呢是用英文。So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of IATA, I give the presentation on the categorizations. So first, do a short advertisement for IATA. So what is IATA? Now, it's a global trade association for the world's airlines. So we stand for the most air transportation in the world. And the mission for IATA is represent, serve, and lead the airline industry. For IATA, we believe there's a lot of opportunities for the airline industry. So business opportunities exist in three main areas: for airport operation, transport of goods and passengers. It's probably for the urban mobility. Another topic which is probably outside this symposium is that the relationship between manned and unmanned aircraft. And nowadays in IATA, there is a developing of technology conversation between the manned and unmanned aircraft. What will be the role of the cockpit for the pilot? The role of the aircrew is anticipated to change in the coming 10 to 20 years. That means in the future, requirements for the actual flight crew in the cockpit may be reduced. The number could be reduced based on the enhanced ground monitoring, increased automation, and artificial intelligence in the cockpit. So, in particular, the technology nowadays used in the UAS could be transferred to the manned aircraft. That means the distinction between manned aviation and unmanned aviation could be blurred. So the development of UAS will change the aviation world of today. So we should prepare for that. So our goal is to facilitate the new branch of the aviation by developing standards to support safe and efficient operations, because this is our mission. Nowadays, IATA are working together with ICAO and the regulators on it. The main working area for IATA is first for safety, second for the ATM and the UTM. Third is for integration. This is the strategy for IATA in the recent years. We focus on safety, security, human factors, and develops of SARS. UTM, economics, unmanned vehicles, as well as commercial opportunities. So when we talk about categorizations, nowadays, what's the purpose for the categorizations? With the categorizations, we may impose the requirement for airworthiness, operation procedure, personnel competence, and organization qualifications. And we can integrate the UAS in the airspace and at the same time maintain the same safety level. And on the other hand, promote the development of UAS. So these three philosophies will be the basic conditions when we talk about categorization. And how to do that? So we can think about, for the current situations, let's say with a view of 10 years, we can focus on the current situations and foreseeable development. This is the current picture today. And we can also think about what will happen 20 years later. Personally, I believe US at that time could fuse with the manned aircraft. That means when we talk about categorizations, it will be same for UAS and manned aircraft. It could be same. So let's first have a look at what happened for the manned aircraft today. So we can classify them by dynamics, airworthiness. So we can also do it by operation. We can have general aviation, commercial aviation, as well as transportation. And we can have also give the different requirement according to the airspace. We have different type of the airspace, so we give different requirement, and we classify the aircraft with the airspace. So this is the example of manned aircraft. It could be same for the unmanned aircraft. So today, ICAO and most of the states classify UA by weight. One of the main reasons is to consider about the collision damage to the manned aircraft. But when we have the report for the encounter between the manned aircraft and unmanned aircraft, most of the report describe it by size. You can think about that. The pilot cannot report it by the weight. They cannot tell the weight. What they can see is the size. So it is possible to classify it with size. Another thing is about operation and airspace. Just now, our colleague mentioned about from Europe, they have the categorizations proposal, I say with open, specific, and certified. It could be possible. And for all these three categorizations, it's come from the perspective of the damage or the influence of unmanned aircraft to manned aircraft. But let's say if 20 years later, if manned aircraft and unmanned aircraft are equal in force, or even US is dominate the aviation, what will happen? So it's a new diagram needed. So first, from the perspective of IATA, we don't think we need to duplicate the manned, the US as duplicate of manned aviation. They needn't to be the same. And when we talk about airworthiness, so sometimes it could be possible there is no standards, no airworthiness regulations, but we can still use the industry standards as a complementary. And one thing we should remind is that when we certify the airworthiness, give the airworthiness certified to the aircraft, we have to combine to consider about the operation procedures. Another thing which is quite important is for reps, command, and the control could be one of the approval fields for the authority. And it could be involved personnel and organization approval. The pilot could be licensed, and the organizations could be approved or should be approved. So it really depends on the situations, on the risk that today the US brought to manned aircraft. And for the SMS, it's a basic concept to keep safety today for civil aviation. And for the US, it's same, but it could be simplified. And we do not expect to develop a new set of terminologies for SMS. It could be the same, use the same structure, same content, same philosophy. So we anticipated that for the US, there's no single categorization standards for various purposes, because we cannot give one categorization for all the purposes. It could be a matrix to describe the different requirements. And ultimately, the true integration into non-segregated airspace will require appropriate procedures and thorough safety assessment of both UTM and ANSP. And with the involvement of US, I believe US will eventually to be fused with manned aircraft. Probably it will happen in 20 years or 30 years, or could be sooner. That's all for my presentation, and thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honghai. It's very interesting to hear from IATA how they vision this. And imagine this. In 20 years from now, fusion of RPAS with civil aviation, no difference. Things are going fast. Let's see if we can keep up. Our next speaker is Scott Duffy from CASA Australia, who will explain his view on this all. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I've made it by 8 minutes before lunch, or afternoon at least. Thank you very much, Nico, for those kind words. Before I start off with the presentation, I'd just really like to say thank you very much to ICAO and to our host for organising this fantastic event. I really do feel it's going to be a great week for everybody. And I would really ask you to all think about what you want to get out of this week. Please try and immerse yourself in the many discussions, and please be open to many of the new ideas and thoughts as we try to address many of the challenges that you're going to hear about over the next few days. Networks will be initiated and networks will be strengthened. So please take the time to share those ideas, knowing that we are building a drone future today for tomorrow. My presentation really focuses on the state of the nation. Rapid expansion is something that Australia has been faced with for the last 3 to 4 years. And it really brings a lot of challenges. And from the presentation, I'm going to touch on a few of the key points and some of the strategies that we've put in place in order to help to address some of these. So we have a short overview of our regulatory, a snapshot of the industry, and I'll leave some thoughts with everybody about how we can shape the future. I do love the statement that a picture tells 1,000 words. So in the last few years, you can see that there's been a rapid increase. And I'll just touch on a few of the sort of key points. REPLs, which is our remote pilot license, which is the individual pilot licenses. That's almost reaching 10,000. Our REOCs, which is our operator certificates, which we give to organizations, is very close to 1,400. The number which is almost going off the chart is a recent regulatory change that we introduced in 2016, which talks about the notification system, and that's actually linked to an excluded category. I'll talk some more about that. But in 24 months, over 13,000 people or organizations have notified CASA of their intent to operate in the excluded category. So hold on to that thought a little bit more and I'll explain more. So just to give you a snapshot about the regulatory setup in Australia, we've got a branch of 23 people, but we actually have a lot of support in the background. And we really focus on operations, policy standards, technology, and the future. And this is a really interesting point because within our branch we actually mandate we will look into the future, which I think is not uncommon for regulators now, but it definitely was in years gone by. I'm going to talk about future technology. So our branch, some high-level functions that we are responsible for. When you go through that, I won't dwell too much, but it pretty much means that we are accountable for all things relating to RPAS. Traditionally, a lot of regulators have set up a unique model where they have operations and standards and different branches and divisions, and they all come together. CASA's taken this modern view or contemporary view of how we can manage the RPAS sector, and one of the things that we've done is we've put everything under one branch manager. So from an operational point of view, which I'm responsible for, we do policy, we do regulatory development, we do enforcement, surveillance. We are responsible for engaging with organizations such as ICAO, JARUS. And one of the key elements, which I will touch a little bit further on, is that we're responsible for the safety education and promotion. So the sector in Australia is really sport and recreation. I know we're sitting here chatting about largely commercial operations or potentially international operations, but domestically, we're faced with many challenges. So sport and recreation is one, commercial operators. The regulatory services that we actually, and the products that we provide in support of these activities are the operator certificates, the excluded category privileges, and flight authorizations. We provide a variety of different approvals and instruments in support of activities, whether that's flying at night, BV loss, above 400 feet, operations within controlled airspace in proximity to controlled airdromes. Excuse me. And in talking about how we manage some of the challenges is that we've introduced a risk-based approach to surveillance. With the amount of operators that we have, you can see the challenges that not only we face, but you also face as well. So the introduction of the excluded category in 2016 was a new piece of legislation that really allows a person operating in one of two areas. One is the excluded category, so commercially operating a sub 2 kilo drone, or landholder privileges, where you actually operate on your own land. And the key success is that this is identified as a lower risk operation. It is not deregulated. There is standard operating conditions which support these activities. And there's been over 13,000 people and organizations notify CASA of their intent to operate. That's probably more than we probably even thought was possible at the time. But one of the key elements to them notifying CASA is that we are now in a position to connect with 13,000, potentially more drone users that we didn't have access to previously. So within the two concepts, as I explained, it is not deregulated. We do have regulatory provisions in place, and it's really interesting to see that within the sub 2 kilo and the landholder provisions, how we're able to support those operations. Safety education and promotion. There's a view that this is a shared responsibility, and I think that most of you would probably all agree, because you're all sitting in this room today and you've traveled many, many miles from different parts of the globe to listen to the thoughts and views of many people. So the shared responsibility means that it's everybody's obligation to discuss what the safety elements are and to promote the safe operation of drones. And a couple of the things that CASA's put in place really to try to support that is, yes, we have regulations. We introduced a new direction recently, and I know that I'm talking on behalf of Australia, and I am Scottish, so just a little hint. There are many people who like free things in the world, and I'm pleased to say that CASA has a free app for drone users. We have a lot of information which helps to support our drone users in terms of online tutorials. CASA has YouTube channels which not only talks about drone safety information, but other aviation safety information. We're on social platforms as well. We have pamphlets, we have web information, and it's readily available to not only the users, but to people throughout the world. So tomorrow's world. Collectively, we're all responsible for how we shape the future. And a couple of things that CASA's really tried to focus on is the introduction of sector risk profiles. That's happening right now. That's not just unique to the drone sector, but it's actually We've looked at a few of the other GA sectors, and that really is CASA's opportunity to engage with industry. We run workshops and we deliver outputs as to understanding really where the risks are from a regulatory point of view and from an industry point of view. We then take that information and we help to shape the roadmaps. And these roadmaps are very important from a regulatory point of view, but also from an industry point of view, is to understand what direction that we actually are going to move forward in. A couple of key points were in there, and I think a few of the people have started to speak about that. Other things that CASA takes into consideration is that, you know, if there's any sort of Senate review, and one of them was recently conducted within Australia, and CASA also ran its own drone safety review. And we were really pleased to say that we had just short of 1,000 submissions, and that was a real positive outcome about how we then start to shape the legislation from a performance-based, and I will talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. But it's really interesting to see that we have a very proactive, engaging RPAS community within Australia. And in closing, I would like to say that I hope some drones were used in the opening promotional footage of the Sichuan province. It was really encouraging to watch. And I would encourage you all to keep talking, and let's make this week a success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. Very interesting to hear from Australia, who's really depending on aviation to move around in this big, should I say country or continent? I never know. But it's really depending on this, and I think that's why you're one of the leading states in making this work. So we heard now from JARUS, which is a lot of countries together. We heard about IATA. We heard about Australia. But now I'm wondering how ICAO is thinking that and really working with the RPAS panel on how doing this. So please welcome Mark.
Morning, everyone. Hello. Welcome again to the symposium. Hope you get as much out of it as we hope you provide to it. I'd like to start off today, just start off as an introduction. We'll wait for the slides to come up. There we go. There are numerous efforts, as you've heard so far from our presenters, worldwide going on with regards to the development and categorization of UAS and RPAS. Harmonizing these various schemes is a concern, particularly when we start talking about international operations. If we want to be able to conduct operations cross-border, then these schemes also have to be coordinated so that both people on each side of that border agree with the concept on how the categorization was conducted. Given the complexity of the categorization issue, the ICAO RPAS panel has conducted significant discussion on the issue of categorization and the best way to move forward from a international perspective, and in a way that could help states and regulators advance their regulatory activities. Although the RPAS panel itself, its primary focus is on the international IFR operation side of the house, it was deemed beneficial to create a categorization scheme to provide a couple of significant points, the ones you see on the bullets. First of all, is to provide a clear boundary as to what the RPAS panel's work is, and hence what it is not. So it focuses on certain things and doesn't focus on other things. That being said, there are also additional groups within ICAO, the UAS advisory group, that works on some of these issues that are outside the scope of the panel itself. And some of those issues will be discussed during Drone Enable 2 on Thursday and Friday of this week. The other thing that these categorization proposals provide is, for those that aren't familiar with the subject or the issue of UAS, it provides them an understanding of what's within the scope and what's outside the scope when it comes to the ongoing activities, when it comes to the SARPs that are being created by ICAO, etc. As the Secretary General discussed this morning, the key point is unmanned aircraft systems are aircraft. So that's an established issue. What we can see by this slide, though, however, is there's a variety of these kind of aircraft, whether it be the recreational users on the top left, whether it be unmanned free balloons, top right, or more of the traditional large-scale approach unmanned aircraft, which we refer to as RPAS, or the drones category, those things that are smaller, that don't follow the traditional aspects of manned aviation. We could throw a couple of other categories in there. There's airplanes, there's helicopters, which can further delineate the various categories that are out there. ICAO makes a clear distinction between the RPAS and the UAS category so that we can effectively do the work. And it also addresses which one of these type categories can be accommodated into the standard traditional airspace structures, air routes, flying near manned aircraft, and which ones can't be integrated, or it may be more difficult to integrate those. Obviously, the UAS that can't meet the standards or the traditional standards are going to have to be dealt with in a different manner. How do we figure out what that manner is? Again, we have to go back to figuring out, let's put them into buckets, let's categorize them so that we can create standardized ways of addressing how these aircraft are integrated. As you've seen from a couple of presentations, one of these is to figure out an operation-centric view of categorizing aircraft, the unmanned aircraft, particularly smaller ones. So just a quick review here on what the operational-centric risk-based approach would look like. First, on the left-hand side, you have to identify what those hazards, what the consequences, what the risks are. And that flows down into, here are what the real risks of our operation are, or a particular operation. Then we have to figure out what sort of defenses are in that system already to handle some of those risks. They could be regulatory, they could be training, technology, could be procedural, could be education, a lot of different tools that could go in there. And then we have to put those control mechanisms and mitigations in place so that when we identify a significant risk, we can bring that risk down to an acceptable level, as shown by the triangle. We want to stay away from those that are unacceptable and move towards those that are in the green. Then once we've completed all that, we sort of have to ask ourselves some questions. The risks that we identified on the left, have they been addressed properly? If not, we need to go back, right? Is the mitigation effective and appropriate? Is it working? We need to follow up on it, make sure it's working. If it's not, again, we have to go back to figure that out. Same thing goes with the final one with regards to, now that we've created all these processes, have we now created a new risk? We may have created a risk. We have to go back and make sure that's been addressed to ensure things are conducted safely. So with regards to the categorization scheme that we've been looking at within the RPAS panel at ICAO, it's been looked at to support the concept that U.S. regulations should be proportionate and appropriate to the risks of those variety of aircraft that we saw on the previous slides. Establishment of a categorization scheme is out there to assist the states so that they can, again, produce viable and safe regulations to allow these kind of operations to take place. Similarly to the previous slides we saw, there's 3 categories that are in this proposal for a categorization scheme. We haven't given them a particular name to them. They're A, B, and C, and we'll talk about those here in a second to see how they in a bit of detail. First of all, categorization, category A. These are those low-risk operations. So from the start, we put a box around the operations and they become low risk just simply because of how they're managed. These would likely be visual line of sight. There would be specified distances from air drones from people, etc., maximum heights above ground, things like that. These type of operations could be permitted without the need of any specific authorization or certification processes. They could be incorporated into regulation and permitted to operate on a fairly routine basis. As we move up, category B, this is a category that sort of starts at a medium risk, but by regulations we can reduce that to a lower category. It sort of fits in between A and C and catches those ones that are not quite the low risk, but are also not equivalent to the risk of a manned aviation. So in this case, it would include those that the risk to persons and property on the ground are more than what would be accepted for a Category A type operation. Or, on the other side, if they're sharing airspace with other aircraft, but the risks are still low enough that it doesn't warrant a full traditional aviation certification, they may fall into Category B. And I think as states and organizations start moving forward in these similar types, that's what they're finding. Again, Category A is pretty simple. We build a box around them. They operate in a very specific environment. Category C is those that are like manned aviation, and everything else starts fitting into Category B. Might be good, might not be good, something we'll need to think about as we move down the road, and we talk about this a bit further in the presentation. In this case, there would be authorization required from the Aviation Authority. Restrictions and limitations will be based on the operations of the operations, the UAS, and the personnel, certification requirements for the aircraft, procedures for the operations, training and experience of the personnel, etc. And approvals based on that risk model, risk mitigation, similar to the SORA, some of the things we talked about earlier, and going through that operational centric risk assessment. Then Category C, those would be the large aircraft, those that are intended to fly internationally next to the 757 on international airways, in and out of airports, etc. Basically, once the risks get to a level that are similar to manned aviation, we need to start treating these aircraft in the same manner as manned aviation. And again, whether that's operator, flight crew, remotely piloted aircraft itself, higher associated risks will now require certification for those particular items. Operations likely be conducted visual line or beyond visual line of sight. However, portions could be still in the visual line of sight regime, i.e. when there's takeoff and landings occurring, things like that. In this case, this is where the bulk of the ICAO standards and recommended practices would be applicable, and the work of the RPAS panel is modifying those and amending those so that they can address this category as they evolve. But with that, then we have some food for thought, some things I'd like you to think about as we move forward, not only in this panel, but in the next few days. Categorization for manned, in comparison, can be pretty simple. Whether it's a mass breakpoint, whether it's a total number of passengers, it can be fairly simple when we start categorizing manned aircraft. It becomes a little more complex when we start talking about the UAS and the RPAS. And I think the challenge is to enable, again, that international operations. These points and these factors that we're going to consider for the new categories are going to need to be harmonized and standardized internationally. Because again, as we talked about earlier, the whole focus of, if we look at current manned aviation today and ICAO's role, the reason that an airplane can take off from Hong Kong and fly to Toronto, where we're going to be going to next Monday, is because these standards are agreed upon on an international level. And it goes back to Houston's discussion earlier today about trust. Nations trust other nations that if the aircraft's certificated, if the pilots are, and the operator are, then you can come fly in our country because you met the standards that are. We need to do the same thing, or at least consider that, when we're moving towards these other categorizations, and how we determine what bucket and what boxes and what factors we consider. Second bullet's important. Categorization, which is funny, it may actually be the easy part. It may result in many more questions and unanswered questions. One that often comes up, and you're going to hear it a few times probably during this week. ICAO Annex 2 has a requirement that to operate internationally, the aircraft, the crew, and the operator have to both be certificated, and those certificates have to be on the aircraft. Okay, so if you want to do that the flight from Hong Kong to Toronto, you have to have these on the aircraft, and they have to have. How are we going to now permit or need to adapt the regulations, however that's going to work, to allow an aircraft that is not certificated, perhaps the pilot have a license, perhaps the operator doesn't have a certificate from operating cross borders, okay? I go back to this first statement I made that the categorization could be the simple part. Answering all these other questions are what the challenge is going to be, and hopefully some of those can be worked out through the week. The categorization scheme that we're referring to has been provided in our draft Annex 6 proposals, which currently are being circulated through various expert groups within ICAO for their opinion, which will come back to the panel, with the intent being that in mid to late 2020, that these proposals for categorizations would go out to states, at which point they have the opportunity to comment on those. And hopefully, again, further provide an opportunity to standardize what we mean when we're going to categorize these various aircraft. With that, that's all I have for today.
Thank you very much, Mark, and very well explained what the ALPA's panel was doing and ICAO is doing in the categorization, and that based on risk. I was running into risk of having not enough time for all your questions, but at the moment I don't have any questions on my iPad from you, and I don't know if that is the iPad or if it is you, but if you want to be interactive, if you want your questions to be answered, please put them on. Until I receive them, I have some questions of my own. With your indulgence, I want to continue 10 minutes and take some time of your lunch. Mike, first for you, just short answers if you can, but the question I wanted to ask you is, can you give me an estimate when the European legislation will be on categorization would be effective in Europe? I know they're working on it for JARUS with EASA, with Eurocontrol, but when will it be legislation? Is that years, months?
Thank you, Nico. I always get the easy questions. For the categorization A and B, as ICAO mentioned, that we come open and specific, but they're the same roundabout. They will be in place by 2018. The effective date will be 2019, because there's a whole process to follow. But then, of course, there's also the category C, and that will take some time. But in principle, 2019, everything should be in place.
You see, we are moving fast. We are taking into account the rapid development of this. I have a question for Honghai on the IATA perspective. You said we need to have a new paradigm, no duplication of the regulations that we have, simple SMS. With those changes that we do, can we maintain the same level of safety if we, the way I feel it, but I might be wrong, if we simplify things that we are doing now and introducing that variety of different drones into our aviation system, can we keep the same level of safety according to IATA?
Of course, from the perspective of the IATA, since we stand for the airlines are, no matter if it's cargo or passengers, we hope that with the introduction of the UAS, we still can keep the same safety levels. But on the other hand, we as the airlines can find a big business opportunities from the UAS. So we want to promote the development of the UAS. So it's partly at the beginning of the UAS development. So the regulations should not be as strict as manned aircraft. Otherwise, we will not give the space, give the room for the UAS to develop. So the structure could be same, but the requirement and the details of this requirement could be different, so that we can give the appearance for the enterprise to grow up. So it could be possible. And nowadays, since the philosophy for the UAS is different from that of the manned aircraft, since it's probably, let's say, for the parcel delivery. So the requirement could be totally different.
Okay.
So this is my opinion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For Scott, I have another question, and I see now a question up, so I make it short. Australia is depending very heavily on aviation because of the distribution of goods, of people, and I think RPAS and drones will have the same influence and same dependence for Australia. What do you, Scott, see as the greatest hurdle to fully integrate your efficient and safe aviation system with an efficient and safe drone RPAS system?
Thank you for the question, Nico. I suppose the biggest challenge is technology. We're going to require a technology solution. And this sector is a huge advocate of technology. Some of the other aviation sectors and subsectors aren't quite there. And I think that's one of the key parts to the integration and the successful integration.
Okay, thank you very much. And I see now questions coming up, and one is almost the same question I wanted to ask to Mark, so I take this question from the iPad. The ICAO classification from A and C that you explained and that Mike explained as well from the JARUS, are they similar? Are they the same? Are you working with JARUS very closely to have the same sort of categorization?
Thank you, Nico. Thank you, Nico. I guess I would say that we've obviously gone out and we've used the expertise of those organizations such as JARUS, such as other states, and using the variety of information we're getting from all those agencies to try to put forth a more standardized, more agreed upon categorization scheme. So are we working directly with JARUS? I wouldn't say working directly, but obviously Mike is in the group, and various members from JARUS themselves are actually in our RPAS panel and contributed significantly to those categories.
Thank you, Mark. Mike, do you agree with this?
I hope it's working now. It's working now. Now, the working together with all the organizations is quite interesting, working very fine. I think what most people need to understand is that we are now trying to incorporate very innovative ideas and operations into a very conservative environment. So what we normally have, but it's based, for instance, like good airmanship and remain well clear. These are elements that are well known in manned aviation, applied by good airmanship. And now in the regulatory part, we need to start changing them and start to put them into perspective for system perspective. And that is going to be the biggest challenge, because normally if you are a VFR pilot and you're trained, depending on your instructor, you're being explained very well what remain well clear means and what good airmanship means. And now we need to quantify this into regulations and certain standards, and that's going to be the biggest challenge. It is actually the biggest challenge we're facing now.
Thank you, thank you. I have one question, and I don't know who wants to answer this, but it says, it sounds like there are several international fora working on developing categorization schemes in parallel. How will these ultimately be made into a single global standard for categorization? I think we discussed it a bit, but do we need, and I want to change this question a bit, do we need a standard categorization for all drones, since some is domestic and some is international?
That's where some of the challenges from the ICAO side came, in that we, traditionally ICAO deals with that international IFR type operations. But in the recent years, we've been requested by states to start looking at these operations that may in fact be domestic, but it may be in a domestic op that has an impact on the international side of the house. So from a categorization and a standardization, if we still want to enable and permit that international type operation of the various classes or categories, there's going to have to be standardization between the countries out there. It's almost impossible to see how you're going to have country A come up with a standard, and in country B, it's going to be a bunch of bilateral agreements instead of an international standard for it.
Yeah, I think I fully agree, because I think what aviation makes so unique is that there are no physical borders in the air. So everything that is domestic can always go. And I come from a very small country, the Netherlands, and you're out of this country in a very short time. So everything domestic can be very quickly international. I'm looking a bit at your lunchtime, and there's no new questions coming up. So I would like to ask one question for the speakers for here, and please answer as short as possible. Just one question, and you can even answer yes or no. We're doing a lot. We see that in 20 years, some people think we might be fusing the things together. Are we able to follow this development and to safely regulate this growth and be able to integrate them in the way we are working now? I'm going to start with Mark this time.
I think we can. I think we need to look at innovative ideas, as was talked about earlier. We need to change processes. As an example, mentioned earlier within ICAO, we have the standard RPAS panel work, but until recently we started the UAS advisory group. The intent of that is to speed things up in this ever-changing industry of UAS, especially the smaller category. We have to have that flexibility. So I think if we have the flexibility and we change up our process, I think it's entirely possible.
Thank you. Scott?
Since you asked for the short answer, I'm going to give it to you, yes. But I'll elaborate. So there's a couple of key points there that when we talk about the success in the future, we talk about the technology and we talk about what does that mean in the future. And I personally believe that there's that opportunity. Harmonization will help. Some things that we actually have to be mindful of, which are outside the scope of these discussions, are such things like social acceptance, privacy, and other matters. But I think it's really important that we remain mindful of them as we start to progress on these journeys. And I think that we have the technology today in certain aspects, but how do we bring it together in a harmonized fashion? That's why there's so many beautiful people sitting in this room at the moment trying to help succeed.
Thank you. I think we already know what you wanted to say, Honghai, because you introduced this, that we will be able, but please.
I really support the program of the categorization led by the ICAO is valuable. It can be provide good guidance for the states. But my suggestion is that it could be do it as quickly as possible, because things are changing very quickly. If we make the categorization, let's make it into formal, let's say in 5 years later, probably things will be changed. So this is, I said that probably will, if you think about, let's say, more than 10 years, our philosophy will be changed. Probably at that time, unmanned aircraft could be dominate the civil aviation. It could change our world, change our view. So do it quickly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So you're more or less saying we're fast enough, but we have to work a bit on our flexibility. Mike, final?
I can only echo what the gentlemen have said. I think yes. And then basically go back to my ATC work. I'll still depends. I think what we need to work on is have a common understanding on the integration challenges. I think that is not the case. We have a lot of people with very good ideas, and sometimes there is a link missing to what actually is happening at the moment. And I think on the other part, we need to know where we're going. So we need to have a common vision, what is achievable in the next few years, and work towards it.
Thank you very much. I hope you all agree with me that this was a very interesting panel. I hope you learned a lot from these experts. And please join me in thanking them for their work. Thank you very much. And I think we have some announcement about lunch.
Thank you, Nico, and thank you again to all of our speakers for those excellent presentations and discussion. It is time for lunch. So just a reminder, it is through the hotel lobby in the Paradise Island Cafe, where some of you had breakfast today. Please go and enjoy and be back here at 2 p.m. for the start of our next session. And again, speakers will ask that you come back a little bit earlier to discuss with each other and to continue coordinating with your moderators. Thank you very much.